This story was told to me by one of my good friends who's of Navajo descent on her father's side. It happened several years ago when she was spending the last 2 weeks of summer visiting relatives on a reservation in New Mexico, and is by far one of the creepiest things I've ever heard. My friend Jessie was 12 at the time and playing outside with her cousins. They were tossing a frisbee around, and one of the younger brothers threw it too hard. It flew over the fence and was swallowed up by a small grove of parched burr oak trees. Jessie, being the oldest, went to retrieve it, leaving her 11-year-old cousin Ellie in charge until she got back. The sun was setting, lighting up the sky in brilliant shades of orange, as Jessie made her way over to the grove. After poking around, she found the frisbee caught in one of the tree branches. As she climbed, she began to sing an old Navajo song, but she paused when her body suddenly went cold. That's exactly how Jessie described it to me. Cold, as if she had been dunked in ice water. You know that annoying, scary story cliche of feeling like you're being watched? Well, it's only a cliche because it's true. Jessie could feel a pair of eyes following her, even when she looked around her and saw nothing. Seriously creeped out, she grabbed the frisbee and ran back to her grandma's house, just in time to see the old woman step onto the porch and call for the kids to come inside. The true horror didn't start until several hours later. Jessie, her cousin Ellie, and Ellie's little sister Clara were asleep in their grandma's guest room. Jessie woke up to the strangest sound she's ever heard. She described it to me as a cross between radio static and the noise that the old movie reels make. At first, it sounded distant, but after a minute or two, Jessie realized it was getting closer. Beside her, Ellie rolled over and muttered, "What is that?" "Don't know," Jessie whispered. The girls waited, holding their collective breath. By now, the sounds were right outside the window, and Jessie realized it was singing. At this point in her retelling her story, Jessie went white and began glancing over her shoulder. She told me that the song was the exact same song that she'd been singing in the tree grove earlier. "It sounded so wrong," she said, rubbing her arms as if a cold breeze had rushed past her. "Remember when we listened to that clip of the very first recording of a human voice? How weird it sounded?" When I nodded, Jessie added, "It was like that, but a little clearer. Somehow, that made it even worse." Jessie and Ellie were both terrified while Clara, unaware, slept on. Through the thin blue curtain over the window, they could see a dark shadow of something peering in at them. To this day, Jessie can't explain what motivated her to get up and see for herself, since she was scared shitless. Ignoring Ellie's protest, she slid out of bed and walked across the room on shaky legs. As soon as she drew back the curtain, she regretted her decision. Staring back at her was the most horrifying creature she had ever seen. It had the head of an emaciated deer, with antlers like dead tree branches, and eyes so black they seemed to absorb the faint silver moonlight. It had a scrawny humanoid body, with abnormally long arms and legs, and as Jessie stood there, caught in its hideous gaze, it raised a claw hand and scratched at the window with a horrible screeching sound that made Jessie's skin crawl. It was Ellie's scream that jolted Jessie out of her terrified stupor. She stumbled back from the window and landed on the carpet floor. Clara woke up and began screaming too. Then the grandmother ran in and turned the light on. The thing at the window had vanished, leaving behind 3 scratches in the glass and 3 terrified girls. Jessie's grandmother managed to calm the hysterical children enough so that they could tell her what happened. As she listened, her age-weathered face became progressively paler. She hustled the girls downstairs to the living room and made up a bed for them on the couch. She then sat by them all night, and whenever one of them would ask her what was going on, the old woman simply shook her head. Needless to say, Jessie and her cousins didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jessie's grandmother announced that everyone was to stay inside for the day. No arguments. She looked so shaken, nobody dared protest. Around noon, she called for a medicine woman to come bless the house. Later, after the woman left, Jessie marched into the kitchen, where her grandmother was loading the dishwasher. "Tell me what that thing was," she said bluntly. Her grandmother sighed and motioned for Jessie to sit down. "You've heard of the legend of the Skinwalker, yes?" Jessie frowned and nodded, vaguely recalling the story. So that was a skinwalker? Her grandmother nodded. Grandma, said Jessie as the light dawned, I think it overheard me singing in the tree grove yesterday. Her grandmother's dark eyes narrowed. Why do you say that? Because it was singing that same song. You know, the lullaby you used to sing to me when I was little. Her grandmother was silent for a long time before whispering, You are a very lucky girl, Jessica, but luck has its limits. From now on, you must be more careful. The look in the old woman's eyes as she spoke those words still haunts Jessie to this day. As I said earlier, that was years ago, 7 to be specific. Jessie has returned to the reservation many times, each without incident, but she has never set foot in that tree grove again, and probably never will. Jessie's grandmother died this past March at the age of 87, and Jessie later moved in with her aunt for the summer, so she could help clean up the old house, which the family was going to rent out. She had been there for about a week when I went down there to visit her. On my first night, we sat on the porch and drank some beers, and I felt my eyes drifting towards the tree grove. So that's where it all happened? Jessie shuddered and nodded. Tomorrow I'm taking you to see the medicine woman and having her bless you. Is that really necessary? The look that Jessie gave me nearly turned me to stone. You think nothing will happen to you because you're white? But when you're on Navajo territory, you're in Skinwalker territory. Take caution. I nodded. That night, I swore I heard radio static outside the house. When I brought it up to Jessie the next morning, she didn't speak, but grabbed my arm and practically dragged me to the medicine woman, where I was blessed. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip, and I went back to the city unscratched. I didn't post this here with the intention of teaching a moral, but I suppose if there's something to be learned from the story of the singing skinwalker, is that there are things out there that we can't explain. The look at Jessie's eyes when she re-encountered her experience told me everything I needed to know. What she saw truly horrified her, and all I can say is, I'm grateful I didn't have to go through it myself. My 2 buddies and I went on a hunting trip for bull elk last November, and we were having a great time to say the least. That, however, would change after what we saw on the 3rd day. Now, I'm not one for superstition, and I don't believe in ghosts and all that, but what we saw there really changed my view about those sort of things. The trip started out normally after we parked our trailers at camp. We got there a day early before the hunt officially started, so that we could settle in and get some scouting done. Only Eric and I had our licenses because Brian didn't draw out this year, but he wanted to come along with us anyway. Brian also brought his German Shepherd named Lucy, which stayed back at our camp with a leash that was connected to a metal spike. The spike was so deep in the ground that I wondered if we would be able to get it out. I asked Brian, and he just told me that the dog was so strong that it had to be that deep. I enjoyed playing with Lucy. She was always excited to see me and would greet me by jumping up on her 2 legs while trying to lick my face. Eric, however, was not amused by her and would constantly yell at her to leave him alone. Anyway, the first 2 days we saw a lot of cow elk in the valley and on the sides of the mountains that I thought for sure that we would see some bulls out there, but there were none among them. It wasn't until the 3rd day of the hunt that we saw a bull elk, but it was too far away to shoot at, and even if we were able to hit it, it would take hours trying to pack that thing out. So that evening we decided to hunker down next to some fallen trees and were able to watch the hillside. While we were surveying the area, Brian spotted a coyote about 250 yards away, walking to a small pond of water strangely, as if it was maimed. Eric took out his binoculars to get a closer look, and he started to describe it, saying, "That coyote, it ain't looking right. It has a hunch on its back like a bear. And its jaw, oh man, its damn jaw seems like it's been broken, and now it's drooping there like a dead fish." "Let me see those binoculars," I asked curiously with an outstretched hand. Eric handed them to me, and as soon as he did, he seemed to grasp his gun tightly. I took them and looked at the animal and said, "You're right, that thing's jaw is just hanging there. Also, did you happen to notice its hair? It's so long and unevenly dispersed. I then handed the binoculars to Brian, and he looked at the coyote for 1 second and screamed. "Shh, Brian, shut up, we're hunting," Eric whispered harshly. "What did you see?" I asked and looked at his shocked facial expression. Brian looked at his feet and muttered, I saw my dog Lucy, but it wasn't her. I don't know what that was." "It couldn't have been your dog. When I looked at it, it looked like a dying coyote. It didn't have the large black spot on its back, or your dog's strawberry red sides and underbelly," I said in a plain yet confused manner. "Well, since we're not going to see anything out here because you screamed like a baby, I'm going to put the coyote out of its misery," Eric said angrily as he raised his rifle and looked through the scope. A large shot followed, and we saw the animal drop soon after. It was a clean kill, and Eric was curious about seeing what was wrong with that animal up close, so he started getting ready to hike out. As soon as he got his stuff together, he said, "You probably just didn't get a good look at it, Brian. Your dog is fine." Brian stood up, and as he brushed the dirt off of his butt, he replied, "I swear I saw my dog, but an evil, demented version of it, with human eyes. But you guys are probably right. There's no way she could have had the strength to yank out that metal spike holding her back at camp." "Well, let's go find out the truth about this animal," I said somewhat excitedly as I started walking towards the dead animal. It took about a half hour to hike over to it, and we lost sight of the animal's corpse as we passed through some trees. Once we finally got to the spot where the animal had dropped, there was no corpse, just a puddle of blood. However, the blood was blackish and very dense. Eric observed the scene and started to scratch his head and said, "I could have sworn I shot that thing straight through the heart. There's no way it could have gotten back up and just walked off." I had an eerie feeling about this whole situation, and Brian was still afraid it might have been his dog that got shot. Eric, however, noticed the trail of blood leading to the dark tree line. Without asking, he started to follow it and loaded his gun. As he did, me and Brian both freaked out and just watched Eric as he went into the forest. He soon went out of sight, and Brian and I could not leave him there, so we waited. I passed the time by taking a skinny stick and poked the puddle of blood. It smelled terrible, and the aroma hit me pretty hard, so much so that my stomach convulsed and I threw up. "You okay?" Brian asked as he put his hand on my back. Before I could answer, there was a loud shot that echoed through the trees, and we both looked in the direction it came from. "Must have found that animal," I said as I spit into the grass. As soon as I said this, we could now see Eric, but he was full on sprinting. "Run!" he screamed as he ran at us. I noticed that he must have dropped his gun because he wasn't carrying it. I was about to ask him what happened, but Brian grabbed my arm and yanked me towards where we parked the truck. Without hesitation, I ran. We soon made it back to the truck, and my shoulders hurt from the rubbing of the gun strap. I looked back for Eric, who slowed down for nothing. I soon looked behind him and saw nothing chasing us, so I opened the truck and got in without worry. Eric then climbed in and told me to hit the gas and go. I was perplexed on what Eric saw out there, and I knew he hardly ever got scared of anything, so this started to freak me out. I started driving fast back to the camp and asked Eric, "What did you see out there that was scary enough to make you drop your gun?" "I don't know, man. That was no damn animal. I followed the trail of blood and it stopped at the base of a tree, and I was wondering how that coyote was able to climb the tree. But when I looked up, I saw a hairy humanoid creature there. It smelled so freaking bad." Eric went on about how scary that thing was and how he was done with the hunting trip and wanted to go home. We soon pulled up into camp and mutually decided that we were going home. I started to pack up my things and felt like something was missing. I thought to myself, "Lucy, where's Brian's dog? She's usually so excited to see us back at the camp. She normally wouldn't stop barking and whining to be set free." As soon as I thought this, Brian started screaming and crying. I ran over to where he was and saw that his dog was gone. However, on further inspection, I noticed what Brian was looking at. Something had pulled out the metal stake in the ground and strung Lucy up in a nearby tree and had skinned her. Brian could just not stop crying, and Eric ran over to see what was wrong and just stood there, jaw dropped and frozen. He then muttered, "She was skinned alive. There's a bunch of bruising caused by strangling her neck where the collar is." "Shut up, Eric. You ain't helping," I said as I put my shoulder around Brian, who had unstrung his dog's body from the tree. "Skinwalker," Eric said in a low tone of voice as he looked into the distance. He then screamed, "It's a damn skinwalker!" I followed his gaze and saw the animal that looked like Lucy, but it had humanoid eyes and a sticky green glazed looking coat of fur. Brian stopped crying and just stood there, eyes locked on the beast. Eric then whispered with his voice quivering, "We all need to run to the truck on a count of 3. Just leave everything here." Brian and I slowly nodded and agreed with the plan. "Okay, 3, 2, 1, Eric whispered sharply, and we all took off like a pack of gazelles for the truck. We hopped in, and soon after we did, we saw the skinwalker lunge at us and struck the right side of the door with such a powerful blow that it nearly tipped over the whole truck. It didn't stop me whatsoever, and I drove out of there faster than I ever could have. After that, none of us went hunting again in that area. We never even went back to claim our camping trailers and supplies. It was too terrifying to think about what happened to Brian's dog, and that it could happen to us, and that thing would be walking around in our skin. Since that experience, I'm now a superstitious person. Growing up in Arizona, myths and legends are part of life. Native traditions, mystic places, vortexes, UFO abductions, and dozens of other stories of the unknown that I always found fascinating. I grew up spending a lot of time wandering around the desert and the mountains, hunting, camping, etc., so I felt very home in the wilderness. One late spring day, on one of my many hiking adventures, I wandered off the trail, came upon a small group of old mud adobe houses. A few people heard me coming and came out of the houses to investigate, and after apparently making a collective decision that I was not a threat, one of the elders dressed in old-style, traditional, native clothing and a headdress came over to greet me. The man spoke slowly and told me that I had wandered onto the Navajo reservation and asked me if I was lost or needed help. When I told him no, I was lost, but intentionally, he chuckled and invited me to eat with his family. The next several hours were some of the greatest experiences of my life. The whole thing was like being thrown back in time. While we ate and talked, others from the surrounding houses began coming over to join us, and I got the feeling that they didn't get many outside visitors. We shared stories for hours about life, family, their history in the area, and time spent in the wild. And the longer we talked, the more they opened up and the more interesting the elders' stories got. Throughout the time, there was one man who never spoke. He just sat in the circle listening and watching me. At one point, I told him I did what I call walkabouts every year around September, where I'd go out by myself into the wilderness for 2 to 4 weeks at a time, and this got the attention of the old silent man. When I finished, he came over to the circle around the fire, sat directly on the ground in front of me and asked me to join him on the ground. He told me that years ago he used to do the same thing, and went on to tell me about the canyon he went to. He described it as a dangerous but magical place, and that I would see the world differently if I came back. If must be for dramatic effect. When he finished, he invited me over to his home. The house was small, and through the open door in the back room, I could see it was filled with various animal pelts, coyotes and wolves mostly. He walked over and closed the door, then picked up and handed me an old map and some written directions that seemed like they had been holding on to them for a long time, and just walked away into the back room and closed the door behind him. It was late, and one of the families had invited me to stay the night, which I gladly did. The next morning, as I prepared to leave, one of the women came over to me with something in her hands, handing me a talisman, and simply said, "Dip your bullets in the white ash at the hottest part of the fire," then just walked away. September came, and I packed up for my walkabout. I saw the talisman in the drawer, and something felt right about taking it with me. After a beautiful drive, I was happy to find the Forest Service road marked on the old map. The entrance of the area was remote and overgrown, and tough to get to even with my Jeep, and took me much longer to get there than expected. So I decided to make camp and start the hike in the morning. After a few hours on the trail that looked like it had been forgotten, I came to a stream and the entrance of a secret valley. It was a narrow crack in the tall cliffs with about 4 feet of water running gently through, but too narrow for a kayak or canoe. I hoisted my gear over my head and began to wade sideways through the chest-deep water. The crack in the cliffs seemed to go on forever, but after almost 2 hours I came to a place where it opened up to a small lake in an incredible valley surrounded by tall rock fences. This may have been the most remote place I've ever been to, in the sense that there was no signs that people have ever been there. No trash, no bullet casings, not even evidence of campfires. My first night there was the quietest night that I've ever spent in the wild. No birds, no frogs, not even crickets, but I didn't feel like I was alone there. In the morning after breakfast, I headed out to my first exploratory hike to explore my new home for the next couple weeks. After being stalked by a mountain lion on the hike about 10 years ago, I make it a point of now bringing a pistol with me when I'm on my wilderness hikes. After looking around, I found a narrow path that appeared to be a game trail that led up the side of one of the cliffs and towards what looked like caves from the canyon floor. I made my way up them and came upon an entrance that was much larger than it appeared from below. I made some noises to alert any possible animals I was there and made my way inside. The cave was an expansive singular chamber that went back a couple 100 feet. As I walked, I inspected as much as I could see with my light, but there were no tracks of any kind in the dirt besides mine, so I decided I was alone there and pushed towards the rear of the cave. As I came around the last bend of the cave and approached the end, my headlamp panned across a large pile of bones. Some animal, some human, and very old looking. A small candle sitting on a natural stone shelf. This is the first thing that has scared me in as long as I can remember. But focusing my wits, I remembered that there were no other tracks in the cave, and figured it was from a long time ago. I was still a little uneasy as I exited the cave and was ready to get back to camp. As I came into the light, about 75 feet away, there was the largest wolf I had ever seen, that looked like it was coming down from standing on its hind legs. It dropped down to all fours on a rock and just began staring at me, not growling or baring its teeth, just staring. I pulled out my .45 and shot 2 shots to the side of it to scare it away, but it didn't even flinch. Not only have I never seen a wolf on this part of northern Arizona, but I have never seen a wild animal that did not at least flinch at the sound of a gunshot. We both stood there staring at each other for a moment. I turned and set my backpack down to grab my binoculars and get a closer look, but when I turned back, the wolf was gone. I made my way cautiously down the path back towards camp. I have encountered wolves before, and usually it's not the one wolf you can see that should worry you, it's the ones you can't see, so I was extra cautious for my return trip. Back at camp, I made sure that my gun was fully loaded, and I got my bowstring just in case the wolf came back. I've seen plenty of predatory animals on my adventures. It's part of being in the wilderness, so I wasn't too afraid. Just prepared myself the best I could and went over to the lake to go fishing. Within 20 minutes, I caught 2 of the biggest brown trout I have ever caught, so I decided to stop fishing for the day and take a swim. Back at camp, I made a fire, cleaned my trout, and made dinner while the sun went down. As soon as the sun went down, all the life in the canyon seemed to go silent again. As I put out my fire and prepared for bed, I noticed there was a small flicker of light coming from the area of the cave I had explored earlier up the cliffside, which didn't make sense. It was a moonless night and the stars don't reflect that way. It couldn't have been the candle I had seen. It was way too old and wouldn't burn so bright. I decided to keep my gun close and try to get some sleep. I would investigate the cave again the next day. When I woke at sunrise, there was a gaze along the ground throughout the whole canyon floor. but as the sun rose, it disappeared quickly, and the area came back to life. I made my breakfast, gathered my gun and bow, and headed back down towards the cave. When I reached the entrance, I saw that there were no tracks besides mine around the entrance, and decided to push up the hill further. Just a little further, I came to the entrance of another cave, much smaller than the first one. There was a small flat landing with a large, heavy twisted juniper tree that to my surprise had many small objects hanging from the thin, old-looking ropes tied to the branches. There were bones, but there were also old things definitely made by humans, and looked like they were old Native American artifacts. Thinking I might have found the spot where the old man I met at the reservation had stayed when he was there decades ago, I went into the cave. This cave was much different than the first one. Just a few feet in, I noticed that the walls were covered in what looked like ceremonial cave paintings. As I pushed further back, the cave got dramatically colder, much colder than it should have been, and the walls were completely covered with the paintings the entire way. When I reached the back of the cave, I was not prepared for what I saw. There was what looked like an old altar made out of wood and bones. As I looked around, I saw a little before the back of the cave, there's another shaft in the ceiling that went up, and on the ledge about 20 feet up sat a small figure of what appeared to be a woman. She was small and pale, with her face painted white and wearing some sort of crown made of woven branches with 2 small antlers at the front. I stopped and stared at it for a few minutes, and the figure did not move, so I assumed that it was the mummified remains from a long time ago. Not wanting to disturb the burial site, I turned and walked back out of the cave, but when I began to walk, I heard what sounded like a faint voice in an unknown, ancient language. I instinctively looked back towards the figure, but it was gone. I was immediately terrified and ran from the cave as fast as I could, but my headlamp flickered and died. I made my way out, feeling along the walls to find my way, and the whole way I felt like something was right behind me. When I saw the first light from the cave entrance, I began to sprint towards it. Just before I made it out, I looked back, and there was nothing, so I slowed down, but I could still hear the faint voice, and the volume never changed. When I got outside, all the bones and artifacts hanging from the tree were gone. I ran down the path as fast as I could, headed back towards my campsite by the lake. Just as I reached the floor of the canyon, I noticed a large wolf at the tree line to my left, but this time it stayed standing upright on its hind legs. I stopped running, hoping not to initiate its predatory response to chase me, and again, it just stood there, staring at me. I reached my campsite safely and immediately began to pack up. It was too late in the day to make it out before dark, and I did not want to make the hike out at night with all that was going on. I moved my tent so it would back up to the canyon wall by the crack of the cliffside, so I didn't have to worry about anything sneaking up behind me. I built my fire much larger and knew I wasn't going to get any sleep that night. Just as the sun was going down, I began to hear noises coming from the trees, and it felt like I was being hunted. Finally, in the last light of day, I saw the wolf slowly walking around by where the path leads out to the trees, and it began to slowly walk towards me. This time I drew my gun and fired towards the creature, intending to hit it. And while I saw a couple hit the dirt around him, several bullets hit it. Several rounds from a .45 will at least slow down anything I've encountered, but this giant wolf kept walking towards me like nothing happened. I continued to fire until the click of an empty magazine. I reached down and fumbled around in my backpack looking for another magazine to reload, and as I lifted it, the talisman the woman had given me fell onto the ground. I picked it up and put it around my neck and immediately remembered what she had told me. Dip the bullets in the white ash. I looked around but didn't see my backup magazines, so I grabbed my bow, put my arrow that was tipped with a hunting broadhead, and dipped it into the white ashes, drew and fired. I hit the creature just in front of its right hip, and it let out a noise somewhere between a growl and a person screaming that made my blood curdle. I can hear the noise in my head to this day. It immediately turned around and ran back to the trees, and in the flicker of the firelight, I saw the small woman with the antler crown standing there waiting for it. They both retreated into the trees for the rest of the night. I could hear the same faint voice I had heard earlier in the cave. I spent the night outside my tent, as awake as I've ever been, but no longer afraid, and at dawn finished up packing so I could get out of the canyon. The next spring, I went back to the small group of houses on the Navajo reservation that I had found the year before. I was wearing the talisman around my neck, and the first person to greet me was a woman who had given it to me. She ran up to me, giving me a big hug. "You heard me." I asked a group of men about the man who had given me the map, as I was desperate to talk to him about the experience I had, so I could compare it to his own. They told me that he had disappeared shortly after I had visited them the first time, and had not been back. Strangely, when I tried to tell them what happened to me, no one would let me tell the story. The oldest man there, who sat in the corner, kept mumbling words like, "Ye Nosleep." We once again sat around the fire and shared other stories of life and a meal. Before I left the next morning, I found the old woman who had given me the talisman and offered it back to her. She smiled and told me I had a good heart, then just closed my hands around it, telling me to keep it to watch over my next walkabout. I went back to the small village on the reservation several times over the next 10 years or so, until I moved to Oregon, but they never let me tell them what happened. I never went back to that canyon, and while curiosity sometimes gets the best of me, I don't think I ever will. Let me start off by saying that my wife doesn't believe in paranormal entities or anything of that nature. We have 3 cats, and one of them likes to be a rebel, jumping onto counters and meowing at the top of his lungs, just looking for attention. He does this throughout the night, and it's a regular occurrence. Last night, after a few beers and video games, I decided it was time to head to bed with my wife. When I woke up this morning, my wife was basically attached to me with wide eyes and a nervous look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she proceeded to tell me what happened last night. She said around 2:50 in the morning, she was woken up by a noise that sounded like our cat downstairs, meowing unusually loud. After giving her a few seconds to perk up and fully pay attention, she said the meows sounded more like a person trying to mimic a cat. It kept saying, "Hello." After meowing for 2 or 3 minutes, a loud bang came from the door, and then a notification went off on our motion sensor at our front door. When she told me this, I checked my phone. Sure enough, there was a notification for motion detected at 2:52 a.m. I asked her why she didn't wake me up so I could grab my gun. She said she was frozen with fear and didn't want it to hear her make any noise. We're out running errands while I'm typing this, but something made me uncomfortable about her story. Last night, I set the home security alarm around 9 p.m., and we didn't turn it off until we walked the dogs this morning. To make things worse, we had slept with all the animals in the room, and the door was closed. So whatever was in our house or outside the front door was not one of our animals. Obviously, the first thing that came to mind was a skinwalker, but maybe I'm just paranoid. I checked all the rooms in the house after I got up. I'm not sure what I could have done anyway. It's very odd that my wife was scared so badly by something she doesn't necessarily believe in. We bought this house brand new, so no one had lived here before. When I'm home alone, I do feel like I'm being watched, or someone's always walking directly behind me. My wife also said that this house has given her chills since we moved in. Something is just off about it. We just got home and I went to hang up one of my t-shirts in the master bedroom closet when I noticed the board that covers the attic access had been shifted a little. When I asked my wife about it, she said that she's never been up there, and the builders would have placed it back in the original place before they made the purchase. I'm generally getting anxious thinking about what could be going on. Has anyone experienced anything like this? Or similar at least? We were going to my mother-in-law's to get some sage. My wife said burning it should keep whatever's around our house away. My wife and I recently welcomed our sweet daughter into this world, but I've got a bad feeling that she may not be as sweet as she seems to be. To understand why I would say this about my own daughter, I need to give you a little backstory to the situation. We haven't been married very long, as it's not really frowned upon to marry soon in my family. But when we first started dating and staying with my parents, we slept in their living room, and when we woke up in the morning, I noticed the door was still unlocked. but I was always sure to keep it locked. I never really noticed anything else though. I never saw handprints on the door or windows. I never saw anything out of the ordinary at all that would be a telltale sign of an intruder. I brought this up to my dad, so he took me to his office to check the CCTV monitor. No one had approached the house that night at all. In fact, everything was eerily still, except for a large cat that would always hang out in their yard. The cat had been around there for a long time though. We thought maybe it was a neighbor's cat, because we lived on the backcountry of Texas and there were other people out in the woods. But growing up there, I actually noticed a lot of things that scared the shit out of me. I once saw my cat, Salem, shapeshift right in front of my eyes when my little cousin and I were playing soldiers near the woods. One of the old men down the road would tell us stories about a panther that would kill people's horses, but I always wondered if it was really my shape-shifting cat or something. My dad also told me a story about the man that lived on our land before we did, that killed his daughter's bus driver for what she said she did to her one day when she came home crying. He would see ghosts of the dad standing over him while he slept, with a blood-stained shirt and evil radiating from his eyes. And of course, countless other stories of all sorts of things that go bump in the night. None of that really related to the night I noticed the door was unlocked. However, since then, I've noticed a lot of things are different about her than she used to be, but nothing too extreme, just minor things. Things that only people really close to her would know. Like she started wearing makeup when she never really liked it before, and what she liked to eat changed, but I don't really know how to explain it. I only had known her for months, and only had to ask what she liked to eat so few times for dates and family gatherings. Every time I tried to talk to her about it, or ask her if something was wrong, she'd shoot me down. So I just had to deal with the fact that maybe I was just discovering her for who she really is. I got used to it. It wasn't a big deal after all. Like I said, it wasn't anything major, and she still seemed like the girl I loved. And like I said, we had only been dating for a few months at that time. She also started calling me Delicious, which wasn't really a pet name we had used before. I tried to ignore how uncomfortable her tone was when she would say it. It was probably just a sexual way. More recently, I've noticed odd smells originating from under the house when I'm out working around the yard. I've also noticed a greater number of flies and carrion birds. I was hoping a lost dog or some large rodent had crawled under and died, but one day I found the promise ring I had given her that she said she lost before we even moved into this house. It looked extremely old now and caked with mud. I started nosing under the house near where the ring was laying, and I found a large indentation in the earth, as if someone was laying there, but had been moved. Soon after this day, she surprised me with the news that we were going to be parents, and I had been so excited at first until I realized something. I knew my initial suspicions were proven true when she got pregnant. You see, my wife warned me right away not to expect children because of an accident she had when she was small. She was infertile.
I'm a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains, but I think this thing came from hell. I've lived in East Tennessee for most of my life. Growing up, I've heard old wives' tales and urban legends about strange creatures that roam the forests. For the longest time, I thought what every other kid thought, that they were just stories told to scare kids away from dangerous places so they wouldn't fall into a ravine or get lost in the massive wilderness. I never thought any of it was more than made-up stories. That's not to say I didn't spend my share of time with covers pulled tightly over my head when the wind blew branches against my window that happened to face the woods. As I grew older, I found myself gravitating towards the stories of strange creatures in the woods. That curiosity is what started me to investigate such things in my spare time. People around here seem to be obsessed with Bigfoot, as if he's some local celebrity. They tend to ignore or downplay other cryptids. I don't know why. With the hundreds of thousands of acres of unexplored and barely exposed forest, it seems like there's lots of space for anything that feels like making it home there could be left in relative peace. Me? I'm more of a fan of Dogman, unofficially of course. You see, once I graduated high school, my only goal was to become a park ranger. Where else could you work and be surrounded by such glorious nature, even at its most dangerous? There are literally dozens of stories I could tell, but the one that sticks with me is the hikers from a couple years ago. I remember it was early October. I always made the hike up to Klingerman's Dome several times during autumn, gazing out over the canvas of trees spouting a myriad of colors, looking every bit like nature's fireworks show reinforced that I made the right career choice. I was on patrol when a call came in to go to the cabins near Fontana Lake. I got the address and headed south, crossing into North Carolina. When I got there, I was met by a woman who said that her husband, son, and brother-in-law had gone to the lake fishing and hadn't come back. I got the information I needed about their general description, names, and description of the truck and boat, then headed out to search for them. She said they were heading up to Wolf Creek. I called it in and told the station that I would be driving down to Flat Branch to see if they went in the river there. It was a decent drive to get there, but then it was a decent drive to get pretty much anywhere out in the backwoods of the Smoky Mountains. When I got there, I found 3 trucks parked off to the side. 2 of them had empty boat trailers. I checked the description the wife had given me, and it matched one of the trucks. I had a beginning point for my search. I walked up to the water and looked both ways, hoping to luck out and find them coming in from a hard day's fishing. No such luck. There was a house nearby, so I walked over and asked if they had seen my quarry. The man said that he had been out fishing himself yesterday and recalled seeing a boat like the one I described with 2 men and a boy in it. I asked him which direction they were going, and he said west. I asked if he had a boat and could take me up to Wolf Creek. The man's demeanor changed from friendly to deadly quiet. He agreed to take me across the river, but not all the way to Wolf Creek. I accepted what I could get. After a quick jog back to my truck to get my backpack, he ferried me across and quickly left. It was a mile or so to the rural campsite I suspected they had camped at. I started walking along the edge of the river, keeping an eye out for them. It wasn't long until I spotted a boat sitting on the shore. I approached the boat and it seemed to be the right one. Everything about this missing persons report seemed just like someone who stayed out later than planned. It was a little too easy. I would be very happy to find them sitting by the campfire about to pack up and go home. It didn't take long to hike to the campsite, but when I got there, things stopped being easy. There was only 2 tents set up. Both looked like they had someone or something had torn into them. I checked inside each one and found sleeping bags and general camp equipment strewn about. I did my best not to disturb anything. When I came to the second tent, I found something more disturbing. This tent was also in disarray, but as I looked, I saw distinct drops of red. There was a notebook sitting near one of the sleeping bags. I picked it up and paged through it. October 3rd. We headed out for our annual fishing trip this morning. Mom wasn't too happy, but we told her we'd be back tomorrow. To drive to the boat launch was kinda long, but we filled the time talking in about the fish we were gonna catch and generally telling stories about the area. Dad tried to scare me with the story about a cryptid that lives in the area, but I knew he was just yanking my chain. We got to the boat launch and headed out into the water without too much of a hitch. Uncle Roger nearly fell in trying to get the boat undone. He didn't find it nearly as funny as Dad and I did. Once we were out in the lake, we had our lines in the water. He seemed to settle in and enjoy himself. After a few beers, he was laughing about it with us. We caught a couple of fish, but they were too small, and we had to throw them back in. Dad said he heard about a good spot up by Wolf Creek. We had better luck when we got there. Uncle Roger caught 3 largemouth bass and I caught 2. Dad had a big one on his line, but it got loose before we could net it. It was starting to get dark, so Dad said that we should go to one of the rural campsites. We pulled the boat up to shore and tied it to a large tree, then took our gear and hiked up to the campsite. There wasn't anyone else there, which Dad said was odd because the site is normally full. We unpacked and set up our tents, and Dad got a fire going while Uncle Roger cleaned the fish. We ate and laughed and talked until it was dark, and we turned in for the evening. Dad said there was a better fishing spot further west, and he wanted to go there early in the morning before we headed back to the cabin. It's the middle of the night, and Dad is playing a joke on me. I woke up for some reason, and he wasn't in the tent. I could hear rustling outside along with something pawing the ground and snorting. I knew it was Dad trying to scare me. He and Uncle Roger had been telling cryptid stories while we ate supper. I told them they weren't going to scare me like they did last year. They just looked at each other and smiled. I knew they would have something up their sleeves. I didn't bother to turn the light on or go out to check. I knew they would just run away and hide, pretending to be the creature I had scared off. Then, in the morning, they would ask each other if they had heard the commotion, hoping to scare me. I wasn't falling for it. One thing you learn from having a prankster for a dad is not to believe anything you see, or in this case, hear. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but Dad was making it tough. He was stomping and growling around so loud trying to get my attention, but I wasn't having it. When I got up in the morning and went outside, the camp had been destroyed. Uncle Roger asked if I had heard anything last night, and I played along that I had heard some creature outside our tent, but I was too scared to go out and check. He made a good show of searching for Dad and seemed genuinely concerned. I was just waiting for Dad to get tired of the game and come back to the campsite. As the morning wore on, Uncle Roger started talking about going to look for him. I wanted to tell him I hadn't fallen for their little prank, but didn't want to spoil their fun. When noon rolled around and Dad wasn't back, I started to get worried. Maybe he had fallen and hit his head on a rock or something. Uncle Roger was beside himself. He told me he would have already gone looking for Dad, but didn't want to leave me alone at the campsite. We decided to go look for him. Uncle Roger found what looked like a scuffle, and we headed off in that direction. He told me to stay right with him as we struggled through the forest looking for any sign of Dad. I was starting to doubt that this was a prank. I was getting worried about Dad. The further we went, the more I realized how wrong I had been. I wanted Dad to jump out and scare me just so I'd know he was okay. We walked around for hours, searching for him, but we couldn't find him. I was beyond worried now, and I could tell Uncle Roger was too, but he didn't let it on. He just kept saying Dad was probably already back at the campsite now. When the sun started sinking low in the sky, we gave up our search and headed back. Twice, we lost our way and had to double back to get to the site. There weren't many trails out here, at least not many that people had made. When we got back to the site, I ran to our tent, hoping he would be there, but he wasn't. We ate a quick supper and turned in for the night. Uncle Roger promised he would wake me up when Dad came back. October 4th. Uncle Roger never woke me. Dad didn't come back. I said we should call for help, but he told me Dad had the only phone. We were trying to decide what to do when we heard a rustling in the woods and the birds went silent. We looked around for the source of the noise, and unfortunately, we found it. There was a thing coming towards us. It stood on its back hind legs, and its body made these loud cracking sounds, like its bones were snapping into or out of place, echoing all around us. This thing was huge. I literally froze. My body refused to move as this horror came towards us. Uncle Roger grabbed me and yanked me over behind his tent. We tried to hide, but this thing saw us and let out a massive roar. We were so close I could see blood on its claws and teeth. I prayed it wasn't Dad's. What do we do?" I asked. He put his finger to his lips. It looked over at us, then went into my tent like it was searching for something. "Come on," Uncle Roger said. We snuck away from the monster as quietly as possible. We slipped down the bank of the creek and walked downstream to the water. "Where are we going?" I whispered. "There's a bridge downstream. If we're quiet enough and that thing loses our scent, we could hide under it and hope it goes away." I focused on walking as quietly as I could through the water. The sound of the creek was loud, so I was hopeful it wouldn't see or hear us. It seemed like forever until we reached the bridge. It was a small wooden bridge that panned the creek, allowing hikers to pass over. It wasn't a lot of cover. We tried to wedge ourselves into the shadows at the furthest end of it. Time slowed to a standstill as I sat there on the uncomfortable rocks, shivering. Neither of us had our jackets on, and the sun had gone down, taking the warm air with it. I started to doze when I felt a nudge. I looked up and Uncle Roger was motioning me to be quiet. I was about to ask why when I heard the creak of a board on the bridge right above my head. It wasn't a steady walk of a hiker going down the trail. It was a slow, deliberate step on something sneaking or hunting. I listened in mortal terror as the board slowly gave way to the weight of whatever was on it. One slow step at a time. As if I wasn't cold enough, my teeth began to chatter with fear. It couldn't have been very loud. Uncle Roger barely heard it, and went into silent convulsions, motioning me to stop. I bit my tongue to keep the noise down, and continued to listen. Only there was nothing to listen to. Whatever was on the bridge had stopped moving. It was as if it was listening to be sure it hadn't heard anything. I strained my ears to listen for any movement. When I did, I heard sniffing. The thing was trying to catch our scent. For the first time, I noticed there was a slight breeze blowing. It was blowing in the same direction the water flowed, but I had no idea which side of the bridge the creature was on. The wind could be our savior or our doom. Another slow footstep sounded like a bomb going off as the board creaked beneath it. For the briefest of moments, it seemed like it was moving away towards the far end of the bridge. I hoped and prayed that was the case as another footstep sounded, then another. Then another. I breathed a sigh of relief as I heard it step off the edge of the bridge and onto the trail. My relief was short-lived, though, as I saw a face peek around the corner and peer under the bridge. I froze in terror as the thing had looked like a giant monstrous dog walking on its hind legs, snuck around the corner of the bridge and dipped its feet into the water. It sniffed the air and poked its snout into the shadows under the far side of the bridge. Coming up empty, it turned its focus to the side of the bridge where we were hiding. Daylight had faded to dusk. There was precious little light to see by. That was our only saving grace. The shadows were darker here, making us nearly invisible. But that was rapidly ending as the beast approached. My mind was vapor-locked. I had no clue what to do. Running would just give us away more quickly. It was looking like our only choice was to die. At that moment, I was 100% sure of what had happened to Dad. Hot tears streamed down my cheeks at the thought of my father being torn apart by this monster. As I prepared to die, I felt Uncle Roger lean over a little closer. He was right in front of me, and it was hard to see the monster. I saw his hand move towards the ground and picked up a stone the size of his fist. I knew right away what was happening. He was trying to shield me. He would offer himself as a sacrifice to protect me. My tears redoubled, making it hard to see. The monster was almost on us. It hadn't acted like it knew we were there, but at this point it didn't matter. A few more steps and all doubt would be removed. I saw it reach out with its terrible claws that nearly touched my Uncle Roger's nose. That was it. Suddenly it stopped. It lifted its head and sniffed the air. I saw the hair on its back bristle. Then in a heartbeat, it disappeared. Uncle Roger slowly stood and looked around. I tried to do the same, but my legs didn't want to cooperate. I dislodged some stones as I stood, making a little noise and causing Uncle Roger to hiss at me. We stood silently waiting for that thing to come jumping out at us from whatever hiding place it was in. After a few minutes, I began to hope that we were okay. Uncle Roger led the way back to our camp. He said we should change into some dry clothes and get a little rest. It felt so good to be warm again. I snuggled up in my sleeping bag and wrote this message so if we don't make it, someone will know what happened. I hope my dad was as lucky as we were. I read through the entire message, then went back to reread the description of the creature. It was what I thought it was. It was amazing they were still alive. Knowing what I was tracking put me on guard and made me wonder if I was being hunted right now. If it had intentionally left things lay so it could ensnare another victim. I didn't have much hope of finding them, but I would look anyway. I started with the tracks in the camp, specifically the ones around the tents. It seemed like the boy and his uncle had gone towards the creek. The creature's tracks went that way too. It followed them to the creek where its tracks seemed to wander around as if it had lost its prey. I saw where they went into the water to throw off its scent. Smart move. I followed the meandering tracks until they came to a small bridge that forded the creek. The tracks went over the bridge, then through the creek underneath it. That didn't make sense unless they were hiding in the shadows. The creature's tracks made a sudden turn and went towards the trail, then up a hill, almost like something had spooked it. If it was what I thought, I couldn't imagine anything spooking it. I followed the creature's tracks up over the hill. Then they doubled back and followed the creek from the top of the ridge. I noticed there was a good view of the creek. It didn't make sense to be going this way until I found myself back in the camp. It had put them right back in its sights. I was confused for a while. I couldn't find a second set of tracks where they had left the second time. If the creature had slaughtered them at the campsite, there would be a lot more blood, but there wasn't. In fact,
I couldn't find any proof they had come back. Then it hit me. I went back and looked at the tracks again. There were a few here and there, but they were doubled. The boy and his uncle must have come back here after the bridge, then left again the same day as before. The disturbing thing was, I still hadn't seen any tracks of their father. I circled around the camp slowly, looking for anything I might have missed. Eventually, I found a set of adult tracks leaving a tent and going to the edge of the trees. They stopped facing a tree. There was a dark spot on the bark a couple feet up. This had the earmarks of a late-night bathroom break. But the confusing thing was that the tracks never returned. Like he had stopped there to relieve himself and they just disappeared. I searched all around the tree when I made a startling discovery. There were flecks of blood farther up on the bark. I circled out further from the tree and found my terrible discovery. Tracks of the creature with drops of blood beside it. My marrow turned to ice at this implication. I found my new trail hoping I wouldn't find what my mind was telling me I would. I tried to report to the station on my radio, but strangely all I got in response was static. I knew there was areas out here that didn't get good reception, but I didn't think this was one of them, right near a posted campsite just off the trail. I decided I would try again later. I adjusted my backpack and started off after my prey. As a precaution, I pulled out my sidearm and made sure it was loaded. It seemed like a silly thing to do, but when dealing with a dangerous alpha predator, it's best to make sure you're ready to shoot. My hand shook a little when I put my gun back in its holster. I knew this was dangerous. I knew it would be just as easy to go back to the station and let search and rescue take care of it. But I also knew there was a man who was in the clutches of a deadly creature and was losing blood. I didn't have time to waste. I followed the tracks as best I could through the brush and fallen trees. I would lose the trail sometimes, only to pick it up again when I found a few more drops of blood. The tracks ran along the base of the hill heading west until it came to a stop. It was right in front of a mountain. I looked all around, but the trail had disappeared. Finally, in desperation, I looked up and noticed a cave partway in the mountain. I thought about going up there, but was unsure. This could be the home of this creature, or it could be the home of a dozen other animals, none of which appreciate me storming into their living room unannounced. After another thorough look around the area, I decided it was likely where my prey had gone. Clouds had been rolling in all day, and now decided they were done playing nice. The rain began slowly enough, but was soon coming down in sheets. The cave was looking better as I covered my eyes and tried to see where I was going. It was raining so hard I couldn't see the cave anymore. I just kept moving forward in what I hoped was a straight line, over fallen trees, through brush and rapidly rising streams. I finally looked up and saw that I was at the base of the mountain. My direction was off by a little bit, but I ended up a few dozen yards to the right of it, but it was no matter. I started climbing the mountain, being extra careful of my footing, especially in this torrential pour-down. After a few slips, including one that had me nearly tumbling off the mountain, I made it to the mouth of the cave. I slipped inside and enjoyed a moment without water dumping on me. I looked down and the water dripping off of me made a little puddle like I'd brought my own rain cloud into the cave with me. I shook off as much water as I could as quietly as possible. The rain pouring down outside made loud splashes inside the cave. It would have been difficult to hear anything else, but I still wanted to be sure. I unbuckled and sat the backpack down just beside the mouth of the cave. The rain had made it gain extra weight, and I didn't know if I would have to move fast. I opened my pack and got out a bottle of water and drank. It had been a while since I drank anything, and I chugged half of it down. I closed it and save the other half for if I got out of here alive. With that happy thought rattling in my brain, I stowed the water bottle back in my pack and pulled out a small flashlight. I turned it on while pointing it at the floor. The bright beam illuminated the cave. It was large as caves go. I could stand up in it and not reach the ceiling. There were more boulders and stones. It wasn't a smooth floor. The walls were rough. There weren't any cave drawings in here. I walked slowly. Each step felt like I was closer to my doom. I pulled out my gun and held it tightly. The sense of foreboding thick in the air. Two thoughts impressed themselves on me. Firing a gun in here would probably deafen me, and the stench was horrific. It smelled like an open sewer in the middle of August. As I crept deeper into the cave, the sound of the rain diminished, replaced by an eerie silence. I could hear the step of my feet, my breathing, and my heart pounding. As I was seriously considering turning around and leaving, when I saw something ahead of me move. It was big, at least as big as me. I dove against the wall for some cover, forgetting that I was holding a bright light in my hand, so it didn't matter if I tried to hide as long as the light was on. I pointed it at the floor, but I didn't turn it off. I heard a shuffling sound getting closer. I was tempted to turn off the light, but giving the edge to the creature was not a good idea. It already had the home field advantage. I heard it sniffing, but I couldn't see it yet. I decided to find out more by bringing my light up and shining it deeper into the cave. I got the shock of my life when my light landed on the creature, and it was only a few steps away. It was big, at least 6 feet tall, and looked like a dog, with a long snout, only its body seemed elongated. It stood on its hind legs and had hands attached to muscular arms. Overall, it looked like a nightmare. It recoiled from the light and let out a growl. It was all I could do to keep from soiling myself. Without thinking, I pointed my gun and fired. The sound was deafening. My ears instantly started ringing. The creature roared at me and then turned and ran deeper into the cave. It had roared a mere few feet from me, yet I barely heard it. I stumbled and I had to take a minute to steady myself. Then I started following it deeper into the cave. To this day, I really don't know why, other than needing to know if this hiker was alive. I looked at the ground to see if there was any blood, but there wasn't. I must have just startled it with a shot. That wasn't great news. I'd hoped if I would have hit it, it would be wounded. Just scared meant it would be ready to fight when I saw it again. After all, I'm sure to the creature I was the invader and it was defending its home. I continued farther into the cave, shining my light and watching for any sudden movement. I had no idea where it was or if it was setting a trap for me. I felt a whiff of air and jumped back a split second before the claws sliced the air where my face would have been. I rolled and came up shooting, holding my light beside the gun to illuminate my target. I fired over and over, pointing and shooting without having time to aim. I watched as it ducked every shot and ran with inhuman speed. Just before it disappeared from sight, I saw it skip a step as I fired my last shot. My hopes soared that I hit it at least once. I ejected the magazine and put a fresh one in, reminding myself that I only had one more, and chastising myself for not being more careful with my limited ammo. I justified it by telling myself there's no use dying with a full magazine. I followed once again, nearly jumping for joy when I came to the spot where it had disappeared and saw a spot of fresh blood on the ground. I was hoping for more, but as I went, the drops were every few feet. Even though it didn't seem like much, at the speed it was running, I was sure it had sprung a major leak. I followed the trail deeper into the cave. There was a chill in the air that made me shudder. My mind told me it felt like a tomb, my tomb. I shook off those thoughts and continued until the blood stopped. I shone my light on the small puddle in the ground beyond where there was no blood. My mind screamed at me that it was a trap. I shone my light all around, even on the ceiling, but I couldn't see it. I started backing out the same way I had come in, my eyes darting all around in search of my prey. It hit like a bulldozer going 60 miles an hour. It had come out of nowhere and rammed me in the back. I sprawled out onto the floor, rolling to a stop. My flashlight laid a few feet away, and I had no idea where the gun was. The wind was knocked out of me. I tried to breathe, but couldn't. I just laid there gasping for air. It slowly circled around me, growling and bristling. I knew it was going for the kill. I screamed at my brain to move, but my body refused to cooperate. I tried to focus on my breathing and regain mobility as it circled closer. I could see its breath chugging out its mouth like a steam engine. I knew it was time. My arms were the first to recover. I slowly moved it towards the flashlight. It stopped circling just as I got a grip on the light. I saw the creature hunching to lunge at me. I clicked the light to strobe and aimed it at the creature's face. It screamed and clawed at the air as if it could fight off the light. I rose to my knees, keeping the light on. When it turned away, I shone it around, desperately searching for my gun. I found it a few yards away and tried to run for it, but my body hadn't fully recovered and I fell flat on my face. My life in the balance, I didn't bother with the pain of my freshly broken nose. I crawled towards the gun with every ounce of energy in me. It seemed like an eternity until I put my hand on the grip and brought it to bear on the creature. It had recovered and was running at me full speed. I shone the strobe at it again and it veered away from the light. I stood and aimed at it, squeezing the trigger. I saw the satisfying impact of the bullet in its side, and squeezed the trigger again, and making another hole on the far side of its chest. I squeezed over and over, hitting it each time and watching it reel from the impact. But it stayed on its feet. It growled and charged as my slide locked back, showing an empty chamber. I shone the strobe in its eyes once more, but this time it just ran off to the other side of the room. I used the distraction to eject my magazine and load in the last full one. I released the slide and started firing immediately, hitting it in the hind quarter and leg, but not stopping it. I stopped shooting and forced myself to concentrate. I aimed carefully as it ran towards me, and at the right moment, I squeezed the trigger. It went down hard, squealing like a stuck pig. It thrashed and clawed at its face, tumbling over itself. Blood flew everywhere from its many gunshot wounds, but it still continued flailing about and squealing in pain. After a few minutes of this, it finally settled down and was still enough for me to see my handiwork. I had shot it in the eye. There was nothing left but a bloody hole. I didn't dare approach it. I stood at a respectful distance and watched, my gun ready if it tried to make a move. Its squeals became moans, finally turning into a heavy sigh, and then it was still. I shone the light at it, feeling cautiously optimistic that this thing was no longer a threat. And then I remembered what I was doing here in the first place. I tried to get my bearings and proceeded further into the cave. My main thought was not only finding the hiker alive, but also hoping and praying that there wasn't another one of those creatures here. I didn't have another fight like that in me. The path curved downwards until it came to a large open area. I shone the light around looking for anything. Off in the corner, there was a flash of red as I panned through. I approached it cautiously and found it was a jacket. Inside the jacket was a piece of meat that used to be a human being. His throat had been ripped out and his legs were gone. All that was left of him was some bones. The thing must have been working its way up, saving the arms and torso for later. The man's face was a frozen scream. I can't even imagine the horror of being dragged away from your loved ones, only to be murdered and eaten in some cold, dark cave. I wasn't even sure if he was dead when the thing ripped his legs off. I had to stop focusing on such things and decide what to do. If I left the remains here, there was no doubt that some other animal would come by and finish off what the creature had started. I needed to try to get him to his family for closure and a proper burial. I bent down, trying to figure out how to carry him. A fireman's way was out. There was no legs for counterbalance. In the end, I picked him up by his arms and flung him over my shoulder, holding on to them and turning his body into some macabre backpack. I started back out of the cave, hoping I'd be able to carry him all the way back to the campsite and finally back to my truck. As I trudged back through the cave, I came to the section where our fight had taken place. Shell casings and blood were strewn about the ground. I wondered to myself how I had avoided getting hit by a stray ricochet when I looked over to where the creature lay. Only, it wasn't there. I shoned my light all around, frantically whipping around, but it was gone. I found the spot where it had laid still, and I thought it had died. There was a huge pool of blood there, but no body. I pulled my gun out of my holster, ejected the magazine, and checked to see how many rounds I had left. There were only 2. I hoped that wherever that thing was, it was no longer in the mood for hunting or revenge. In the end, I decided there was nothing I could do. If that thing attacked me, I was defenseless, carrying literally dead weight on my back. I holstered the gun and hitched up my human backpack, then shone the light towards the mouth of the cave and kept walking. My hearing was starting to return to normal, although I was sure I would have some permanent hearing loss. I could hear the shuffling of my feet as I staggered towards the cave's opening. When I got there, I found a world transformed. Daylight was just starting to peek its way around the corner. However, the rain had created a massive fog bank. I couldn't see anything down in the valley I had come from. It was a sea of fog. Only the peaks of the mountains escaped its suffocating blanket. I looked over and saw my backpack patiently waiting for my return. I laid my burden down and got the water bottle out. Glad I had saved the last drink for now. As I sat on the edge of the cave precipice, I looked down and wondered how I was going to get the body down there without falling to my own death. For an instant, it was tempting to throw it down and find it at the bottom once I had climbed down. But I thought this fellow had been through enough and didn't need the indignity of becoming a human frisbee. I dug through my backpack and found some bungee cords. I bungeed him to my back and carefully started my descent, leaving my faithful backpack to watch me desert it. I wish I could take it with me, but there was no way I could carry both. As I climbed down, there was a few times I lost footing and nearly took the short and deadly route down. Fortunately, I made it to the bottom in one piece. Instead of celebrating, though, I discovered a new problem. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I had no idea how I was going to find my way out of here. I decided to go straight away from the mountain and hope the fog cleared as I went. The rain had turned the forest into a marshland. The ground was soft and the streams had overgrown their banks. I found myself wading through knee-deep water on more than one occasion. As I trudged along, hoping I had enough energy to get back without collapsing from exhaustion, 2 thoughts chased each other around my mind. Where was the other hikers? And where was the creature? I hadn't seen any other remains in the cave. If it had killed them, it hadn't had the time to take them back to the cave yet. Perhaps my pursuit had forced it to retreat to its cave before it could properly retrieve its other bounty. I had to keep my ears open for any sounds of it following me. The most disconcerting thing was the lack of forced noises. The animals and birds were strangely silent. Usually that meant a predator was nearby. In this ungodly fog, perhaps they were just sleeping, waiting for it to clear. That sounded good. It gave me the false illusion that I wasn't in mortal danger from a wounded alpha predator bent on revenge. But I couldn't focus on that, or worry would drain my resolve to get us both out of here. I took a breath from trudging and tried to get my bearings. I checked my watch and I had been walking for over an hour. It was late morning and the sun should have been high in the sky, but the oppressive fog continued to smother it. I looked around, but there was nothing to see except the dingy gray curtain of hopelessness. I was about to collapse and give up when I heard it. The faint sound of hope. I could hear the creek running. As hope rose, it was suddenly dashed. I heard the sound of a footstep behind me. I whipped around so fast that my macabre backpack nearly made me lose my balance. I couldn't see anything through the fog, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. With a renewed surge of determination, along with a strong desire to elude whatever was pursuing me, I set out towards the sound of the creek. It was still low going, but I found fearing for my life was a great motivator. I had no doubt whatsoever that the footsteps behind me were those of the creature bent on revenge. After what seemed like an eternity, I gazed at the most awesome sight I had seen all day. Wolf Creek in all its 6-foot wide overflowing bank's glory. I followed it until I came across Lakeshore Trail, and the journey became much easier. The fog was even beginning to lift, which was a blessing but also a curse. I could finally see far enough behind me to confirm that the creature was indeed following me. I had wondered the entire time why it hadn't overtaken me, but now that I caught sight of it, I understood. It was grotesque. It looked like it came straight from hell. Its one eye socket was leaking gore, and the many bullet wounds covered it in blood. There were places where I could see internal organs trying to escape the body, and its right leg had a bullet wound. It limped severely. As I watched it, I wondered how it made it this far. But then I looked into its remaining eye and saw intense rage burning. I knew I would die a horribly grotesque death if I slowed enough for it to catch up. We continued this slow OJ pursuit of death until I reached the banks where Wolf Creek opened up into the lake. My energy was nearly gone. At one point, I considered dropping my human backpack in hopes that it would feed on it instead of me. But then I would have failed. I came here to find this hiker and bring him back. The thought of it lit a fire deep within me. I came to the edge of the lake, with the creature a mere few yards behind me. I glanced around, hoping to see a boat I could flag down, but no such luck. With no other choice, I waded into the water. It was cold, but instead of refreshing me, it chilled me and sapped my little remaining strength. The creature entered the water behind me and seemed to be gaining. It got deeper to the point where I was no longer able to walk and had to start swimming. The far side of the lake looked like it was miles away, even though I knew it was much less than that. I swam for all I was worth, knowing at any moment I could be pulled under by the creature. My passenger strap on my back wasn't helping either. The literal definition of dead weight every minute I had to fight off the urge to dump him. When I reached the other side, I was exhausted. I laid there on the shore, waiting for the creature to disembowel me, but unable to move to defend myself in any way. With great effort, I turned to look back and see when my doom would come. To my surprise, I saw it staring at me from the far beach. I guess it couldn't swim. I chuckled to myself as I laid there gathering strength for the continued journey back to the truck. Eventually, I got there. As I opened the door, for a fleeting moment I considered putting the hiker in the passenger's seat. But then I looked at the wet, gore-soaked torso and reconsidered, gently laying him in the bed of the truck. The drive back was long, and I continually had to shake myself to stay awake. But eventually, I made it to the cabin. I stumbled up the door and knocked once. "Oh my God," the woman said when she saw me. "Are you all right?" I hung my head. "No, but I will be after around 3 days of sleep. Unfortunately, I have bad news for you. I found your husband, but not your son or your brother-in-law." A man and a boy came out of the cabin and stared at me. I instantly knew who they were and grabbed them both in a huge hug. "I'm so glad you made it out," I said, fighting back tears. Thanks," the man said, pulling out of my hug. "Who are you again?" "He's the ranger that came to look for all three of you," she said. "I don't understand. Your tracks were confusing," I said. "I followed them down to the bridge, but then they went back up to the campsite." "We got some rest," the boy said. "Then Uncle Roger came and said we were going. We left everything and slipped away on the boat, rowed our way across the river and left." I smiled. "I'm very happy you did." He looked at me with expectant eyes. "You said you found my dad?" My face fell. "I did, but it was too late." "So he's..." I nodded somberly. "Where is he?" "He's in my truck, but you don't want to see that." Before I could say another word, he ran to the truck and looked in the passenger seat. A look of confusion fell over his eyes as he saw no one there. And then he slowly looked towards the bed of the truck. He stepped back and looked over the side into the bed. He instantly dissolved into tears and slid down the side of the truck sobbing. "I'm so sorry," I said to the woman and man. She grabbed me and gave me a hug. "Don't be," she said. "Without you, we wouldn't have known for weeks, months, maybe even years what had happened. We would be going on with false hope. You've given us a chance for closure and to properly grieve." She released me and I wiped my eyes. I looked at the man and walked down to the truck. He followed and we gently removed the body and laid him on the couch, then covered him with a blanket. The boy followed us back to the cabin, but wouldn't look at me or anyone else. He sat in a chair and stared at the blanket covering his father's body. I knew I had done all I could, so I excused myself and started towards the door. I paused and said to the boy, "I promise, I'll make sure that thing never hurts anyone again." He looked up at me, eyes full of tears, and said, "How will that help my dad?" His mother opened her mouth, but I held a hand up to silence her. I knew the boy was just hurting. I left without another word. On the drive back, I called the station and told them everything that had happened, and then told them I was going home and calling off for the following day. After getting home and stumbling into a shower and collapsing in bed, there was only one thought on my mind. I would return to Wolf Creek very soon with more and bigger guns. I would end that monster if it was the last thing I did. But that is another story.